I want to share with you today what it's like to work with a sober coach. There's a lot of people who really just don't vibe with traditional recovery methods, which is fine. There are many paths to recovery, and I just wanted to share with you what it's like to work with a sober coach. So, as a sober coach myself, I usually work with people who tend to lean on the over responsible type. So, it's high achievers. I have a lot of doctors, attorneys, executives, people like that, like really high functioning, high achieving people who want to quit drinking and traditional methods don't work for them for whatever reason. Sometimes it's because they have like this need for privacy and anonymity. Schedules can be really tough for people that are in like a CEO role, things like that. So I wanted to give you just a little insight on what it would be like to work with a sober coach. I'm going to actually give you some of the practices and exercises that I would give my clients. The first thing that I do when I start working with somebody is I give them a sheet that helps them identify what are their values. So, what are the things that are really important to them? But the idea is to identify what your values are. It kind of goes in line with this idea that it's hard to hit a moving target. So, if you have clarity about what you really want and what your values are, then we can start working towards that. We can start working to identify what are the blocks to those things. So I often get things like, achievement, health and wellness, family and friends. So anyway, we identify what the values are, and then the question is, what is important about those values, or how will you know if you're embodying those values? And what I hear a lot of times is like, especially like health and wellness or spending time with friends and family, balance is a big one. That's a big value. And I'll say, what's the goal here? And the goal is typically something like, I want to eat healthier. I want to spend more time with family and friends. I want to have more balance. And the problem with words like more, it's too vague. Like if someone says, I want to earn more money, I can give them $1 and be like, okay, that's more. So is that fulfilling? No, that doesn't. So more, it has to be quantified because you have to know what the target is that you're trying to hit. Otherwise, you just have like this vague sense of failure all the time because it's really hard to know what the win is. So how will you know if you hit the target? So if it's eating healthier, it's like, well, what is a reasonable goal for eating healthier? Well, it would be things like, cutting out carbs 3 days a week. Let's just start with a small goal, right? Cutting out carbs 3 days a week. And then when you look back over your week, you can see whether you hit that target or not. And we do need to allow for flexibility, right? Especially people that are really busy, like if you have kids or a big job and a lot of responsibility. Like if someone says that they want to start exercising, it's good to be consistent, right? But consistent doesn't necessarily mean daily, right? Like if you have a target of 3 or 4 days a week, if you miss one because you're traveling or there's something going on with the family and you miss one, that's the temptation is to think that you failed, right? And sometimes it sets off like a shame spiral. And I know this is like, what does this have to do with being sober? Well, if you have clarity about your vision, about what you want, you can identify, even if it's like being sober, you can start to identify what it is that you want and then what is preventing you from having it. Let's just start with the values. So that is usually where I start somebody in their recovery process is like, well, what are your values and what's getting in the way of that? And then the second part of that first call that I do with somebody is to get their family history. Like, what did the parents do for a living when they were growing up? Like, what were some of the significant events in childhood? Because, see, whatever happens in childhood is sort of what sets the stage for adulthood. And the reason that is important is because if you had trauma when you were very young, it affects the way that your neurology develops. There's this great book called What Happened to You, which is a really interesting turn of phrase instead of saying what's wrong with you, right? So it's like, what happened to you? So the events in childhood shape the way our neurology develops. And this book, What Happened to You, was written by this Dr. Bruce Perry, who did brain scans of children who had traumatic events. And what he found as he compared these brain scans to healthy children's brain scans is that traumatic events changes the way their neurology, their brain develops, right? So this whole point of looking back at childhood, what were some of the traumatic events? What was your relationship like with your parents, your siblings? What were the significant events in childhood? That tells me how somebody's neurology was shaped. So the way that somebody responds to stress in childhood develops these neural pathways, and those neural pathways are repurposed in adulthood, so that when you get stressed out as an adult, this is why a lot of people drink, right? Is because they never developed a healthy way in childhood to process their feelings to resolution. They were taught to isolate, deny their feelings, avoid, especially if like a child had some sort of experience where they felt powerless, right? They tend to dissociate from those feelings. And so in adulthood, a lot of high achieving people are very dissociated from their feelings. And so it's important to start this process of internal self-reflection to find out what happens to you when you're stressed out. Stress is probably one of the biggest triggers for someone to reach for a drink. Oftentimes I hear people talk about how they feel like they deserve a drink at the end of the day, right? It's because they're so stressed out. That's their way to dissociate, disconnect, and manage stress. So that first call, after identifying what that person's values are, what their goals are, and finding out like how their neurology developed as a child, it really gives me a lot of information as to why they behave the way they do in adulthood, and specifically under stress, right? A lot of high achieving people are under a tremendous amount of stress. What's interesting about high achieving people is that they've learned to leverage this ability to dissociate from their feelings, right? People that are high achieving have a high threshold for stress. They can endure a lot of frustration, a lot of pressure. They can push past a lot of work, like the workload and stress that other people do not have to deal with. They've learned to use their skill of dissociation, which is actually a survival skill. They've learned to use that as a coping skill and use it to become, high achieving in their professional careers. Doctors, lawyers, CEOs, things like that are very good at pushing past fear by dissociation. So all this for the first meeting is a lot. It usually takes an hour, hour and a half to sort of go through this whole process. And this is the foundation of coaching, is getting an understanding of where somebody is, what their stressors are. And at the end of the call, I typically end with some homework, which is about starting to reconnect with those feelings, right? So they're really good at dissociation. They're really strong-minded intellectually. And so it's time to start dropping from the head to the heart, because your feelings are there for a reason. The feelings are your internal compass. That's how you decide what is really good for you or not. You know at a gut level, like what is good for you and what isn't. And so often, high achievers, I have a doctor who, through her residency learned to deny her own needs. She's a surgical doctor. And so she was taught to completely deny her own needs, and that serves her in her profession. It's a terrible skill to have. It's a barrier when it comes to personal relationships. So a lot of these high achieving people can be very highly productive, but then they suffer in like their personal relationships because all their skill set is based on survival, and relationships need a different skill set. So my role in this whole process oftentimes is I'm like a resource coordinator, right? I can identify when certain resources will be good to answer certain problems that they're having. And I often think of sober coaching like the client is like the kite. They need to be able to ride the waves of their emotions. And I'm like the grounding cord. I help to keep them grounded. I help them to stay within these boundaries that they have set. Like, these are my values, these are my goals. And I can check in with them regularly and say, is this still Is this still a value for you? Is this still a goal for you? I think what's interesting is sometimes the values and goals shift as they become more in tune with their inner compass. They begin to realize that they don't like things that they thought they did, or they didn't recognize that they have skills that they actually have. And so this is sort of, I love this saying that you can't read the label from inside the jar, right? When you're kind of in the whirlwind of sobriety and recovery, especially in the early stages, it's hard to be objective about yourself, right? There's so much self-doubt because we break trust with ourselves. Like while we're drinking and we do things, we break our own trust. And so we have all this self-doubt. And so it's helpful to have somebody in your environment, like a coach who's not invested, you don't have a lot of history with. It's just the focus is solely on the client, and someone who can hold the parameters and just and it's parameters that the client has set. Like, is this still important to you? And sometimes it's not. Right? And sometimes your values and your goals change a little bit as you really connect with that inner compass, because you know at a gut check level whether something is right for you or not. So anyway, that is typically what happens during the first session. I end the first session with asking them to get this book called The 5-Minute Journal. I'll leave a link below to that. And what I really love about the 5-Minute Journal is that it's broken now into morning and evening, and I highly recommend that a self-care practice be done in the morning. Everybody can carve out a half an hour in the morning, and I would suggest doing all your prep for the morning the night before. So like decide what clothes you're gonna wear, what you're gonna eat that day, all that stuff. Maybe if you have kids, you prep the kids like the night before, because there's something about morning time that just feels super compressed. Like that time in the morning just goes by so quickly. If you prep everything the night before, you can carve out a half an hour in the morning. And it's so important to do it in the morning. Your self-care has to come first before you put everybody else as a priority. It's like when you're on an airplane and the flight attendant gives that little speech about putting the oxygen mask on yourself first, right? If you don't do your self-care, then what happens is you get stressed out. And at the end of the day, you're more likely to want to reach for a drink. And then you already know what happens if you do that. All the people that were your priority, they're the ones that suffer, right? So logically, it makes sense that if you take care of yourself first, you'll have more of an emotional reserve to respond to stress. Your day will just go better, right? And when I'm talking about self-care, this 5-minute journal, it usually takes me longer than 5 minutes, but it's 3 things that you're grateful for, right? And there's usually like a little inspirational quote. Then you write down 3 things that you're grateful for. It tunes your brain to start looking for the positive instead of focusing on the negative. You think about 3 things that would make the day great. And it could be subtle little things. Sometimes it's the little things that make the day great, but you identify 3 things that would make the day great. And then you give yourself a little positive affirmation for that day. Like as you go throughout your day, you try to remember this affirmation that you said in the morning. And it's something that can carry you through and sort of work as an antidote to all the negativity that's always coming at us. And then at the end of the day, you write down the 3 highlights of the day. What went well, right? You're starting to shift your focus from our brains have a natural negativity bias that kind of is developed out of survival because you're, looking for the danger and how to prevent it, like avoiding pain. That's a very normal thing to do. So we have this negativity bias. So if you're looking for 3 highlights of the day, you start to shift your brain towards looking for the positive, and what you think about, you bring about, right? So we're really shifting our mindset in a very subtle, but very positive and powerful way. And then what was something that I learned today? It used to say, oh, what could I have done better? But I like this other reframe of what did I learn today? Because even if something challenging happened or you made a mistake, if you learned something from it, then it's a success, right? It's learning to turn challenging things and reframing it into a positive thing so you win. So we're trying to create all these wins, right? And then so when I meet with my client the next week, the first thing I do is we start off with the wins. What went well this week for you? And sometimes we just refer back to the 5-minute journal. I have them fill it out and then take a picture of it and text it to me. So I'm kind of keeping track of all the things that are going right. And sometimes if I see that something challenging happened, I can text with them and be like, hey, what's going on with this particular thing? I also have them I have them reach out to me if their stress is like at a 7 or above. It's, like the pain scale from 1 to 10. 10 being like a tremendous amount of pain. I tell them, if you're at a 7 or above, just shoot me a text and just say, I'm at a 7. And either we can text back and forth to try to problem solve, or sometimes they can send me a video message and just vent if that's necessary. Sometimes I just hold safe space for somebody. Sometimes just saying the thing out loud takes the power out of it. It's really magical. I would encourage you, I don't give advice, but I make suggestions. And my thing is, take these suggestions as experiments and you see for yourself. I'm never asking you to take my word for anything. I'm saying run the experiment for yourself and then have an experience and learn something new about yourself. If a suggestion doesn't work for you, that is actually really valuable information to have, because then you know that doesn't work for you. Or if we can discuss, why it didn't work for you, maybe there's just a simple shift perspective that might make that suggestion a little easier for you to take so that you can have a positive effect. Anyway, the idea is to run the experiment for yourself. A lot of people that are trying to get sober have a lot of trust issues, and rightly so. And so the whole idea about run the experiment is something that you kind of want to keep in mind as you're going through this process of changing your mind about how you think about drinking. So getting sober is less about stopping drinking and more about reorienting your mind towards what would work better for you, right? So a lot of it's around self-care. How do you de-stress? How do you take care of your feelings? It's about emotion management. So anyway, that is kind of what a first session looks like. If you're curious and want to know if coaching is right for you, I'll leave a link you can actually put time on my calendar. We can just talk about, I'll talk to anybody and offer a free strategy session. I'll talk to anybody for free for 30 minutes. And if you just need some resources like books or podcasts, or you're struggling with a particular situation that you just might find it would be helpful to get another person's perspective on, you can actually put time on my calendar. Service work is a big part of my own self-care practice and being sober. I've been sober for 30 years, and service work is really important to me. It's the fastest way that I have found to create meaningful connections and to feel fulfilled and to help others and needless suffering. Right? That's what this is all about. So anyway, I hope that was helpful. If you want to see the next session, go ahead and subscribe. And next time I will talk about coaching session number 2. See you then.